All right, well, we're here with Dorothy Hodgson, Professor of Anthropology at Rutgers University. And the first question I usually ask everyone is, how did you get interested in anthropology, or what was your path into anthropology?
I'll try to give you the short story, because I think like many anthropologists, it's a long-winded story. When I grew up, I was actually raised overseas. My dad worked for a multinational corporation. And so I was born in Canada, and we moved country to country to country. And so I didn't come to the United States until I was 13 years old. So even though I'm an American citizen, that was my first. So there was already this sense of what is this thing called American culture that everyone else knew about and I didn't. One of the places we lived in was South Africa, Johannesburg. Cutaway, I was an English major in college. I could easily have gone to graduate school in English literature. I didn't want to for two reasons. One was I loved to read too much, and I didn't always want to have a critical lens taking apart. I just wanted to be able to read bad mystery novels sometimes and enjoy them. The other thing was that as much as I loved literature, I wanted to do something that felt more engaged in the world, and it felt like literature was a little too removed for me. I thought that law might be what I wanted to do, but I was smart enough not to go straight to law school. I went and worked for a law firm for a couple of years in Washington, D.C. It was fabulous work for kind of post-BA, but I learned enough to realize I didn't want to be a lawyer, that unfortunately about 90% of what they did was terribly boring and uninteresting. So much to my mother's distress, I quit my job. I got a 3-month ticket and I went out to Africa, to East Africa. This will age me now, 1985, when the UN Decade Conference for Women was happening in Nairobi. And the one track that does follow is that I'd always been very involved in women's issues, feminist issues, and so forth. So I went out to participate in the NGO Forum, so that's the group of NGOs and activists that kind of accompanies the formal bigwigs doing their polished talks in the actual UN building. While I was there, I went to visit a friend of mine who was working in Tanzania. He just moved out to Tanzania. And when I was there, I was offered 2 jobs.
Wow.
One was because I was an English major. They were just transitioning. There had been in 83, 84, a terrible kind of famine in the Sahel that had affected Tanzania. And so the local Catholic Church had been very involved in distributing food relief. So they were trying to transition from food relief to something called development. They had realized that they didn't have food, but they actually had money. So they took small token payments of money for the food, but had put all of that money in kind of accounts that were going to go back to the villages in a kind of development project of their choosing. So I did that, and then also I got a job teaching in a secondary school, English. So I did that. So my 3 months turned into 3 years. My job with this small development organization, which at the time was 4 people, it turned into 20 people, and after a year I became the head of it, the coordinator of it. So basically for 3 years, I spent 3 years traveling through all of the communities that were part of the local diocese of Arusha, northern Tanzania, that were also pretty much the boundaries of the people who identify themselves as Masai, the Masai pastoralists. And so I had kind of 3 years of basically comparative ethnographic experience going community to community, having village meetings, talking to people about what their problems were, what the issues were. And as I was doing the work was exciting, it was exhausting, but I also had lots of questions about what was happening. I was witnessing a lot of tensions between men and women. I was wondering about what is this thing called development, and is this thing called development actually hurting people, or is it maybe part of the problem and producing some of these tensions? And so then I went to friends of mine. I said, look, with these questions, where do I go? I had kind of always known I go to graduate school in something. And they said, well, it would be anthropology or sociology. And the American, at least the dominant kind of approach to sociology in the US, which is not certainly the case in the UK, has become kind of very quantitative, a lot of counting and surveys and so forth. And I knew from this prior work of being in people's homes and talking to them and basically doing extended participant observation and interviews for 3 years, that it was that kind of qualitative approach to gathering information and to kind of answering questions, it really was much more meaningful for me. And so I applied to anthropology programs, went to the University of Michigan, and have kept going back to Tanzania ever since. And kind of at that stage, it's, you know, it's one of those moments where life always makes sense, kind of looking back and realize, oh, all of these streams, the kind of being an outsider to U.S. culture, the moving around, the African thing, it all kind of came together in anthropology, as well as doing critical discourse analysis and all the kinds of things that came from a training in English literature.
Wow, what a great story. And a lot of the things actually picking up on lots of the other stories we've been collecting so far. Was there something about Africa beyond, was it just that conference happened to be in Africa, or was there a
I think there was something of, you know, because the question people always, you know, why an Africanist too? There was something, even though I was very young, about living in Africa as a child, again in a very white, very privileged way, but I think witnessing, you know, there were kind of romantic notions about it. There was having, you know, studied it somewhat and just being intrigued by the kind of questions and problems and so forth. And then, yeah, having that experience in Nairobi, having the opportunity, you know, clearly the opportunities then in Tanzania, and then of course the commitment to language, you know, having learned Swahili then. I hadn't learned Ma, which is the primary language for Masai. I mean, I learned some basics, and that was something I had to do to go back to really do the kind of research I do. Yeah, it became a, you know, I think with, you know, an emotional commitment that became a political and intellectual commitment.
This course is aimed at a very general public. How would you describe anthropology in sort of a 2-minute soundbite? Or what's the working definition that you use?
Of cultural anthropology.
Yes, cultural anthropology.
Okay, so what I study as a cultural anthropologist is kind of how people are in the world, the meanings they make of the world, the struggles they have over meaning and practice. And again, because I'm actually a historical anthropologist, that is, I combine history and anthropology, I'm interested in looking at how those change over time. My particular interests are looking at how the arena of meaning, or what we might call culture, meaning making, and the world of political economy kind of intersect and kind of co-create each other over time. So not giving one, not saying that meaning is just derived from, you know, our place in the world and political economy, but nor is a kind of, you know, superstructure to that, but nor saying that political economy doesn't matter and that we can just study some kind of ephemeral culture out in the world that hasn't been produced by people and struggled over and kind of shaped, or not determined by, but shaped by certain kinds of limits and constraints in the world, be they economic, political, geographical, class, ethnic, racial, whatever.
Could you just comment a little bit on political economy? Because that's a term that you've used a fair bit.
Right, right. So by political economy, my interest, I mean, I use that to refer to the kind of political, and it's a way of combining kind of politics and what we call economics, that is, and realizing that they're kind of intertwined, that is, that decisions are the kind of economic structures that we live in a capitalist system, right, that they're kind of political, it's a political product, and there are political consequences to that for how we can be in the world and what kinds of possibilities are not. You know, it's not a level playing field. And that shapes both kind of individual trajectories, it shapes collective trajectories, it shapes the kinds of institutions that are available or possible to be created in the spaces. I mean, having worked in a country where socialism was dominant when I started there, of a particular kind, you know, I've studied that. So for me, political economy also refers to, and this is the historian part of me, that the historical moment matters and what's happening in politics and economics matters. It matters that neoliberalism is dominant right now as a political and economic project. We can see it shaping certain kinds of discourses and practices, and again, what's possible both for my own life, but also perhaps more importantly for the lives and livelihoods of the people with whom I've worked for 30 years.
Working in this sort of quite political arena, what to you is the role of anthropology as a discipline? And I ask it in the sense of, is it our role to be activists, to work with and for the people we work with? or are we there to bear witness, to document, or a combination thereof?
Yeah, so we have that discussion a lot. Our program, and we've had that discussion a lot in our program here at Rutgers, and we've come up with, of course, another way of thinking about it, which is not original to us, but we think of what we do in the cultural anthropology program as engaged anthropology. And by that, we try to incorporate the full spectrum. And so we have some faculty and some students who are very much on the front lines politically, who see themselves. We have a current student now who is very involved in the, the Wall Street, the Occupy movement, who's then kind of come into anthropology. Many of our students, in fact, have trajectories somewhat like mine. That is, they've been involved in the world for a number of years and kind of come to anthropology as a place to try to think about and find answers to some of the questions and struggles that they've been looking at. So it ranges from kind of frontline activism through to people who see themselves as advocates, for a particular group, or very involved with some kind of NGO or community-based organization, to people who feel like, well, their work by kind of taking, looking at these things through a critical lens, by bringing questions of power and inequality and so forth to the forefront in thinking through questions, that itself is a kind of political move. I think what they all share is that most of us are using the methodological and theoretical tools of anthropology to think about questions that kind of matter in the world, that are involved in some kind of issue of inequality or oppression or marginalization in the world, be that here at home in the United States, be that in other sites in the world.
Can you tell us how you've addressed a question that matters to you in the world, in your fieldwork in Africa?
Yeah, so my work, began, as I said, quite organically from kind of being involved in development and then going and thinking about these questions. And so the question that has mattered for me, at the very broadest level, it has been, how do social differences become social inequalities, right? I mean, we're all different in different ways. We can go down to kind of, at a microscopic level to a collective level. There's always going to be difference, and I think we can think of difference as kind of productive and part of what makes it such an interesting place to be and teach and, just kind of be in the world. So the broadest question for me are, how do these differences become inequalities? More particularly, I've looked primarily at gender, how gender differences become gender inequalities. And I've studied that through the kind of Masai case. My involvement with Masai, the other way in which it matters is that as a white American woman who's made a commitment to working in a kind of post-colonial context in Tanzania, one of my commitments was that it wasn't going to be kind of to go do my research and to leave. So I made, as both an ethical and political commitment, a commitment to continue going back and continue working. And so since even my first project, all of my research projects over the years have really emerged from that experience. It hasn't been me sitting in my office thinking, well, today maybe I'll go study X. It's been that because of this constant engagement and re-immersion with these communities, I've kind of looked around and said, wow, this is happening, right? The involvement in the indigenous movement, wow, they're going to Geneva and New York. What is this about, and what is happening, and how can I kind of help understand this and maybe help facilitate this? And so my primary political commitment has been to working with a people, that is Masai in Tanzania, who have this long history of being marginalized politically, economically, culturally, linguistically, in every way from this nation, from within this nation state that they live. And so trying to study how and why that's happened, their efforts, their political struggles, and what has been, perhaps the more effective struggles, what has not been effective. So always with a critical lens, not with a romanticized, oh, this is all great and because you do it, it must be perfect, but with a critical lens, but always in also a very, it's not been a collaboration that I've had a formal collaborative partner, but always in a very engaged way. I define myself not as an activist anthropologist, but very much as what I call an interlocutor. That is, I bring certain kinds of knowledge and experience to the table. My colleagues and friends in the communities, from rural illiterate women to lawyer Masai activists, bring different kinds of knowledge, and together we try to figure out how to move forward.
Do you have perhaps a fieldwork story or something that encapsulates the relationships you have, or the way the role of women has changed? I know you've written a lot about the role of religion, how Masai women's roles have changed, or they've tried to change their authority and the way they interact, I guess, within their society. Do you have a story or something you can share with us about that relationship?
Well, I think part of my work has been again working with someone like Masai, who appear in all of the since the colonial times, and kind of postcards and travel logs and so forth. A lot of my work has been about thinking about what those stereotypes mean for their lives, because the images we have of people in the world shape the interventions that we or others make into their lives. And so a lot of what I've done has been kind of tracking that, be they understanding, or be they the British kind of colonial officials coming and thinking, well, women aren't involved in politics, let's focus on the men and create native women. So a story. Which story to tell? So you want a story about kind of gender change?
Okay.
So let me tell you a story about a friend of mine. Her name is Asupat. She was the fifth of 6 wives of a fairly wealthy Masai man. She herself, I think, at the time had a primary school education. She has, I think, 4 children. But at some point in her life, she decided that she was done having children. She wanted to go back to school, and she wanted to do something to give back to her community. I met her kind of at that point in her life when she became involved with one of these Masai women's NGOs that I've studied and worked with now for a number of years, called Mwedo, Masai Women's Development Organization. And so Mwedo helped Asupat to go back to school, to get kind of the equivalent of a secondary school education, to get some training in English, to get some training in computer skills and technology. She and I ended up talking a lot. In fact, she helped me kind of, when I was back in the field at one point, kind of circulating community. She is now a local political officer, there's these women's seats in the local district, so she ran for and took and became the kind of women's officer for her local political organization. She has now traveled the world from New York to Peru to Europe as a kind of representative of kind of Masai women in women's affairs. She's been involved in the indigenous rights movement. She has also helped to bring different kinds of development projects, for better or worse sometimes, to her community, but some that have been really formidable. That is a dairy project, right, that actually spoke to women's economic needs, and was something that really there was a market for it, and so forth. And so, she has gone from being what many people would dismiss as, well, she's, it's a polygynous family and she's so oppressed, and she is kind of set up structures, actually drawing on her co-wives, drawing on other kinds of networks, to really, take herself to a place in the world that I'm not sure she even imagined, right? My own involvement with that has been more to kind of encourage her from the sideline, to, draw on her own knowledge, to, support her in small ways through that time, but really to kind of tell that story. It's a story I do tell in some of my work as, quite formidable. And she has helped to change not only the minds of people outside Tanzania, but I would say the more prevalent kind of oppression that people face in Tanzania is from other Tanzanians, from non-Masai Tanzanians, who Masai call Swahili. And I have watched her at these kind of national gatherings. It helps that she's 7 foot tall, stand up and, speak her mind and really challenge other people to kind of think differently about not just her, but the other kind of Masai women of whom she's a representative, right?
You've mentioned a couple of times now this global but also local indigeneity, NGOs, but also indigeneity discourse. Can you tell us a little bit more about the production of the indigenous that you've written about amongst the Masai in Tanzania, and that relationship between local NGOs that you've worked with and for, and that global discourse around the world?
All right, so I did a project, and it's a book that was published a few years ago called Being Masai, Becoming Indigenous. And again, it was a project that kind of, as I was, I think, finishing my book on the Church of Women, on kind of Catholic evangelization and Masai women's involvement in gender, again, I was noticing that first there were all of these Masai NGOs that had, started over the past decade. And again, as I said, that this kind of debate around indigeneity was happening. They were beginning to call themselves indigenous. And again, always curious, I wondered what that was about. And so I went back and, researched it more directly. And so what that's about is that that these Masai organizations, under the leadership of a man who actually passed away a year ago, Morengi Parkipun, who was a formidable Masai activist. He was a politician. He was one of the smartest men I've ever met in the world, and with an incredibly kind of incisive, critical eye to the world. And I met him back when I was working in development in the 80s. At the time, he was a member of parliament representing a Masai district. He then left that. That, at the time, as he explained it, that was kind of the only space to try to get anything done. Because it was still socialism, civil society was very encumbered. There wasn't a free press, all kinds of things. So anyways, once some of that changed, he started one of the first Masai NGOs called Kipok. More to the point, he had a trip to the United States that I talk about in the book, where he was sponsored by USAID, who wanted him to work on this huge project, the Masai Range project that they had. But he had written a master's thesis that was a complete critique of the Masai Range project. He'd written editorials. I don't know why they hired him. I think they thought that they could quiet his political edge. They couldn't figure out what to do with him. They sent him to the United States to study American ranches. Well, he got quickly bored with that, and in an airport met, I think it was a Hopi Indian, Native American, who said, well, come to my reservation. And anyways, Morenge, or Parkipun as we call him, and as I said, he did pass, went to the reservation and saw that life on this American reservation was much like life in the parts of rural Tanzania where he was from. But what really shocked him was that the kind of the degree of poverty and inequality was happening not in Tanzania, a relatively impoverished country, but in the United States, right? Extraordinarily wealthy country. And so he began to try to think about, or began to see, that the issues that were affecting kind of Masai were affecting Masai, but that there were patterns around the world. He thought about that, as he would, and read about that widely, and he became the first African to address the United Nations Working Group on Indigenous Populations in Geneva in 1989, and gave a speech that's still kind of cited and circulates around the internet today. And he was very drawn to the debates and the issues that were happening around Indigenous peoples. Now, the issue is, of course, as you well know, that at the time, most of the kind of definition of Indigenous and most of the debates were from people who were so-called First Peoples, right? Who were in white settler colonies like Australia, New Zealand, the Americas. Which, again, Masai were not, right? I mean, actually, their migration from northern Africa is very central to their own identity. And as with many African peoples, they had moved around. And so he made an argument that has since, not just him, but others have since made it, and it's been adopted, challenging these kinds of ideas about indigeneity that were premised on kind of territorial origins, and said, look, we're not indigenous in that way, but we are indigenous in that, we've been on this space. What we share with indigenous peoples is a structural situation. That is, that we are similarly, because of certain kinds of cultural distinctiveness, because of distinctiveness in our primary livelihood, that is pastoralism, the herding, in the Masai case, of cattle, sheep, and goats. Because of that, we are politically marginalized, we are economically marginalized within the state, we are forced to speak languages we don't want to otherwise speak. There's been efforts to assimilate us, forcibly assimilate us and our children into these environments. So we share a structural position with these kind of First Peoples indigeneity. So he was allowed to make this argument, and from that moment, he and other NGOs in Tanzania and other places in Africa and also in Asia, where they shared a similar kind of dilemma, right? And Tanya Lee and other people have written about this, became much more involved internationally in indigenous rights movement, because they really felt like, wait, in seeing this pattern and seeing these similarities of structures, both we can learn from this, and we can also use our involvement at the international level to try to leverage changes within the state, right? So they saw it as a kind of political space to try to get some things done, to try to forward their struggle, because they'd been hitting heads against the state didn't want to listen. And so for about a decade, they were very involved in New York, in Geneva, at various, with IFGIA, the International Working Group on Indigenous Affairs, with various of these kind of international advocacy organizations. And it helped in many ways. They learned a lot of lessons. They learned how to kind of frame themselves, how to use the media, how to kind of articulate their needs in broader ways that were kind of beyond ethnicity in some ways, because of course African governments in general were quite hostile to this, and so that we're all African, right? We aren't indigenous. But then, as I document in my book, they also, most of them then backtracked didn't backtrack, but they shifted lenses. And so they did three things. One is they tried to take those lessons from the international advocacy and then use them in national advocacy and figure out more productive ways to try to work with the state. They also, it was a time where the kind of height of NGOs were starting to come under a lot of critique. So they renamed themselves. They were no longer non-governmental organizations. They were now civil society organizations, or CSOs. And they also changed the kind of language of debate or the framing of their situation from the language of indigenous rights to that of pastoralist livelihoods. Because livelihoods was something that had a kind of development edge to it that would speak to environmentalists, development economists, the people who were dominating these discussions, and they mattered. Ultimately, while language mattered, while culture mattered, in a context in which their land was being taken at an alarming rate, protecting their land and protecting their livelihoods was always the kind of key priority for their struggles. And they've thought that reframing their issues in the language of pastoralist livelihoods now would help that. So it's that kind of trajectory that I have documented, but there's still effects. So one of the things that was quite remarkable is that the African Commission on Human and People's Rights took up this issue of, is it relevant for Africa, at the request of many of these kind of national NGOs and the kinds of NGOs I was working with in Tanzania. They set up a working group and eventually said, yes, absolutely, it is relevant, especially for people who rely on pastoralism or gathering and hunting as their primary livelihood, who have had these decades, if not more, of kind of economic and political marginalization because of their kind of cultural and linguistic differences. And there have now been cases that have gone through the African Commission because of this formal recognition and special rapporteurs and all of that kind of mechanism. And for me, that's quite remarkable that they've been able to get the powers that be to kind of recognize that this matters, and it matters politically, and more to the point, why it matters.
That's fantastic. A beautiful narrative too. And I think one of the issues you've been describing is empowerment of one form or another. Talking about the work on gender, but also talking about the work on indigeneity. And again, that's come up in a lot of the interviews. I just wonder if anthropology has a special role to play, or whether it's just the people who are attracted to anthropology who are interested in this kind of work.
For me, the power of anthropology is actually, back to the story of how I, ended up going to anthropology, is in qualitative research, is in ethnography. That is, that we actually take the time to learn the languages, to learn the ways of being, but to actually not just listen to people, but to hear them and to ask them questions. I can't tell you how many times, and maybe you've had this experience, do your research, I'm out in some rural community, sitting on the ground over tea or whatever, talking to people, like no one has ever asked us what we thought. No one has ever asked me what I want in my life, or what I think about education for my children. And I think that the power of, it's also the time that we put into it, but the power of what we can do through ethnography is look at the lived experience, the kind of ideas and struggles of everyday people who often aren't in the lens of economists and political scientists and so forth, and use that to speak back, not just to kind of big theory in certain kinds of ways, but also to big politics, right? To people who are using those numbers and so forth to make decisions that are reshaping people's lives. And yeah, so I think we are drawn to anthropology. I was drawn to it because I like to talk to people, I like to listen to people, I like to learn from people. We're willing to be humbled and to be in that kind of student position, to not presume we know the answers, but we really want to learn the answers, and we want to kind of hear. As I said, there's a difference to me between listening and hearing, and we want to hear what people have to say. And then, yes, sometimes we end up being the intermediaries, right? We're the ones who are reframing those words and putting them out in the world in videotapes or, on YouTube videos. But, increasingly now, these activists I work with themselves are out there. They're doing, sometimes quite extraordinary work. And I think, technology has really enabled a different kind of politics, and that's been quite powerful. So just another story, and it's actually not in the area that I primarily work in Tanzania, but there's an area called Loliondo that's up in the north that's really been the epicenter of a lot of the struggles that Masai have been undergoing. That is, it's kind of a more, it's not mountainous. There are mountains in Tanzania, but it's a quite lush area that was, perfect pasture land and permanent water sources. But it's where now the Serengeti National Park is. So much of the land was taken for animals, away from people, with the presumption that somehow, even though it's precisely because Masai lived in these areas that these animals are still there, but now that humans and animals couldn't cohabitate, it's now the site of much commercial agriculture because it's land that could support agriculture. It's now the site of a lot of other tourism, especially so-called ecotourism that's coming in. But again, taking the land, and it's a very top-down form of tourism. Even though there are some kind of eco-tourist operators that are trying to work with local villagers and arrangements so that people will, communities will directly profit from letting people camp in their lands and walk through their lands and take pictures. Big game hunting is also very big in the area, and big chunks of the land have been leased to generals from the UAE to come in with machine guns and shoot animals. So anyways, as part of this, the government and security forces came in at one point and burned down several Masai settlements. Women were allegedly raped. Many people were violently were hit and so forth, and kind of taken out. Within about 2 or 3 days, there were videos online. You can Google Loliondo is burning. And these activists who I've been working with, and others, but themselves kind of took the tools of the media and got this message out and really launched a kind of international campaign. It was a moment where they wanted international leverage, right? Sometimes activists don't want international leverage. It actually will backfire. But in this case, it was such an egregious kind of set of actions that they wanted this, and just launched a huge campaign and have been able to actually prevent the government from, or get the government to agree to not take another huge area of land that they wanted to take as a buffer zone to the park, that again would have wiped out all kinds of communities who held legal title to the land. So the activism is quite, again, I learned, from these people, and it's quite remarkable what happens, but it's an always ever-changing landscape.
It's a bit of a depressing story to end, but we have to end, unfortunately.
Okay.
Thank you so much for having us and
Sure.
talking to us. It's really interesting. And again, that sort of bringing together different issues, current world issues really, in your work in Africa. And thank you for sharing the stories. I think they're really powerful, and hopefully people will see them, and we can use this as a form of, some form of activism at least, for people to see it and listen to it, and hopefully hear it.
Great. All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.